All right. Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Jacquis. I'm one of the committee members on Somewhere Over the Rainbow. So hello and welcome to Somewhere Over the Rainbow webinars on sexual orientation and gender identity in international education. Somewhere Over the Rainbow is a program of the University of Maryland College Park, and this webinar series is co-presented with the Consortium of Higher Education LGBT Resource Professionals. Thanks to our planning committee made up of Bill Truma, Jacquis, Katrina Knudsen, Nick Sakurai, Dimri Woolway, and Conrad Zutenhorst. This is part of a series of 4 free professional development webinars designed for international education administrators and practitioners who are interested in learning more about these topics. A link to a recording of this session will be posted online in the next few days. You can also go to the website to sign up for our email list so that you can learn more about our programs, such as the in-person conference we are planning for April 20th, 2017 in the Washington, D.C. area. We will post the website link in the chat box now. Today's session is entitled LGBTQ People of Color Abroad, and it is presented by Jacquis Waters and Nick Sakurai. Jacquis Waters currently serves as the Assistant Director for Diversity and Intercultural Development at Maryland Institute College of Art. Her professional interests include social justice, multicultural competency education, and the retention of historically marginalized communities within higher education. Nick Sakurai has been out and involved in LGBTQ communities for over 17 years and has worked professionally in LGBTQ issues in higher education since 2003. They have specialized in LGBTQ issues in international education and has founded or created many events and organizations addressing the interests of LGBTQ communities of color. The full bios of our presenters may be found on our website. Now I will turn things over to Nick and Jacquis.
Hi, this is Nick Sakurai. I go by they, them, theirs pronouns.
Hey all, this is Jacquis Waters. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
We are super excited to be with you today. In a second, we're going to go over the agenda of this session. But I just want to say, for us, this is sort of an opportunity. We've each had different kinds of personal and life experiences. I identify as Asian American, a person of color, Japanese American, mixed race. So there's always all kinds of terms and identities mixed in there, as well as identifying as queer and genderqueer, non-binary, agender, trans, and many other kinds of terms.
So Jacquis again, my identities as far as those social pieces, I identify as queer and identify as a mixed race woman of color from Afro-Latino, Caribbean, and Jewish roots.
Awesome. And, we see this session today as sort of a conversation, sort of a fishbowl. The two of us will be bouncing off of each other at various points. It's not framed as an academic presentation. There certainly are some theories and some things that people can find that address some of these issues. But often we're still in the space where a lot of it is talking about lived experiences. So this session is an opportunity where we'll be reflecting on some of the experiences we've had, but we also invite you to use the main chat box. As presenters, when we get to the end, we hope to have a few minutes to answer some questions from the group, but feel free to post ideas or tips or questions that you pose to other folks who are logged in. Right now, I see there's over 75 people in the session. So you may find that there are helpful tips that other people can contribute. It isn't just about what we have to contribute to this. You'll also note that we have put a file where you can download the PDF of this presentation if you want to be able to flip through it at your own pace as well. So
for our agenda, we already talked about our own little intros for ourselves as presenters. We're going to touch on why we're here and about intersectional identity, and then aspects of an experience abroad. So some observations and experiences, some challenges and concerns, opportunities and good practice, which we'll try and weave in throughout the presentation. And then, like Nick highlighted, we're going to have that Q&A piece. So any questions that you may have towards the end. For why are we here, we have two quotes, and the first one is, "I am an educator who thinks globally." We really enjoyed this quote because it was imperative to us when thinking of an abroad experience. As educators, we're not just looking at how social identities such as race and gender and sexuality play out in our backyard, but we're also expanding that to be our neighborhood, our community, and then other countries. So when we're having students go abroad, what are we doing as far as the education and support for these social identities in a U.S. context, as well as looking at how do those host cultures and communities connect to race and gender and sexuality and so on.
Mm-hmm. And I think, globally can just mean simply going beyond what we sort of assume, right? Mm-hmm. And so some of that, so one example from when I was an undergrad in 2001, I studied abroad in Amsterdam in the SIT program on sexuality, gender, and identity, as it was named at that time. And, I came in with a very queer people of color framework, and we even named this presentation LGBTQ plus people of color abroad. But we want to acknowledge that these are also very US-centric terminologies, mm-hmm. and that these frameworks tend to break down when we look in other cultural contexts. So just being aware that that's kind of, we're coming from that US perspective, but also acknowledging that these terms can be limiting and don't necessarily overlay in really exacting ways into other spaces or frameworks, and that so we should think differently about how that we learn in many ways and how that we question. The other quote, this is Kimberly Crenshaw, who really did the pivotal work to begin helping us understand and identify what does intersectionality mean. And so if we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, we're going to fall through the cracks. And so a lot of intersectionality is not just about I am A and I am B, but it's I am A and B, and these things, they blend together, right? It's not just about oppressed identities. It could also be about dominant identities. But the ways that the pieces of who that we are make up a whole has a really complex interaction. So it's not always that we can just analyze under one framework and another, but that we also have to think about how these things play with each other.
And I would say that even though we highlighted this isn't necessarily an academic presentation, Crenshaw's intersectionality was coined in critical race theory, which absolutely is a great foundation for some of the conversation we're going to be having, as well as in general, what work can we do? Thinking of, so critical race theory, queer theory, Diagelli's theory on LGBTQ folks. So there is a great framework there, and we, in particular, even when we said our social identities, acknowledging what race looks like for the two of us may be different. What our gender expression and identity are different, and so how do we have that intersectional conversation, especially outside of a U.S. context?
Right, and I think that's also a moment to acknowledge that we're speaking in this presentation a lot of our own stories and experiences, whether it's our own personal ones or it's about observations that we've had as educators or as travelers. We're speaking from our own experiences and can't necessarily represent all that is LGBTQ plus people of color, let alone those who go abroad.
So aspects of an experience abroad that we'll be highlighting. So pre-travel in a personal context, we'll highlight motivations and resources ongoing abroad for QTPOCs, program and country selection, support and perceptions of maybe family and friends about going abroad. During travel, there's a piece around safety, wellness, inclusion, community, and support. What stereotypes and visibility or invisibility is happening, and just cross-cultural and classroom dynamics from a program content perspective. And then finally, there's that re-entry. What does culture shock look like when coming back into a U.S. space? What does it look like to talk to your community members and others about your experience?
I think it's important to think about this we are talking about the intersectional and identity piece, but as will, I think, become clear, a lot of the things we're talking about, these really apply to all students going abroad. Everyone has a race, typically, right? Most people identify with some sort of gender, even if it's a gender like me. as in not identifying with a gendered experience, but it is an identity, right? And so all these things impact all the typical areas you would expect. And I think some of the tools that we'll be talking about as suggested questions or ideas that practitioners can use are really ideas that could apply to larger groups, because we know that LGBTQ plus people of color is a fairly niched down category. And so it may not be that you're going to produce specialized programming all the time for a very particular community. Certainly, we'd encourage that when it's possible, but just thinking more broadly about the way that we do the larger work, so that we can contribute to it in a way that elicits thoughts about identity, including all the pieces of who that we are. So we want to get into those pieces that are sort of the pre-travel, like what's going on for folks before that they go abroad. So whether it's travel or study abroad or some sort of an exchange or program where folks are going, say, from the US to another country. Here I've just had a few photos from a trip I took last summer. This was not a study abroad, but it was a personal sort of investigation, right? I had been doing some self-genealogical study for a while, looking really at my mother's side of the family, which is European roots. And I went to Serbia, and a lot of what I was looking at was really about sort of difference, right? Because one of the things I discovered in doing my own personal research was that I had a heritage around a German ethnic minority in the Balkans, right, called Donauschwaben people. And so on the left, there's a gravestone that actually has one of my ancestors' surnames on it. And then you see a mosque from Subotica and a synagogue from Subotica, and then the Donauschwaben crest. And then I'm there in a German Catholic graveyard in this predominantly Orthodox Christian country. And so, students can have lots of different reasons for going abroad. Sometimes it is for a heritage purpose. And so, being connected to that experience. But in going abroad, I was thinking a lot about how I would be perceived as a mixed race person, as somebody who has heritage in multiple axis powers, but in many ways it was a trip that had unexpected outcomes for me, and that I think I felt, I don't normally identify with being white or whiteness, but I felt more white, right? Because I was investigating a European component to my heritage, and also investigating a lot of the, and trying to understand a lot of the ethnic cleansing and war crimes that had happened to the ethnic German minorities in the Balkans, and why that there are so few of them there now. So just thinking about the ways that identity played out there, and also knowing that Serbia was a place where LGBT events in the past had been canceled by the government because of fears of violence and because of homophobia that exists. So just being aware of kind of those pieces of who I am, and whether I could come out in that context, whether I couldn't. I was originally planning to travel with a friend of mine who is Black and Jewish, and that's one of the reasons we went. I had wanted to go to the synagogue, but really just to try to understand more of kind of how minoritized statuses in this very historically multicultural society in the Vojvodina portion of Serbia played out. So we have some broader sort of things to think about then when you're thinking about students or other folks who are queer or trans people of color that might be going abroad. Certainly heritage is one piece of that. Not everybody travels for heritage reasons, or they might find that there's something surprising. I remember in my Amsterdam program that one of the students, we went to Germany as part of that program, and we went to a concentration camp, and it turned out that one of the students on that program had an ancestor who was in that concentration camp. And so just the ways that individuals might be experiencing a situation can be very different, and heritage can really play into that. But I've noticed a lot of folks might go abroad because they want to experience something that's just different from where they're typically residing. It could have to do with identity. I think people get tired of anti-black racism I mean, not that these things don't exist in all parts of the world, but I think the ways that those frameworks exist in the US may look very different than somewhere else. And I know for many students who are also activists on their campuses, that you can get very entrenched in the identity politics, in the ways that things are happening in your local environment. That for me was even one of the reasons I wanted to go to Amsterdam. Was I felt that I didn't yes, there are LGBT issues there, but I could not have to be a queer activist there because that wasn't my own personal community, right? That was the place I was visiting. So I saw it as like an escape or vacation almost from the activism I had already been engaged with.
I think that's a great point. I think going abroad can absolutely be a getaway and allow for reflection to happen. And that reflection could be positive and joyful, and it could be, I just want to experience what queer means in Amsterdam and go to bars and clubs. That's okay. As opposed to, let me see what racism looks like in this space. Ultimately, the students, whether consciously or subconsciously or actively seeking those experiences, will have them. I know for myself, I've gone on 2 different heritage trips. I've gone on a birthright that was specifically for queer folks to go on. And so getting to see Israel in that space with those intersectional identities. And then I got to live in Belize, which is where my father's from, for 4 months and teach sex education. And at the end of those 4 months, it was such an amazing reflective piece around my race, and to also just see folks that look like me. It could be a really healing environment when going abroad for QT-POC folks. And then there's a very real thing of, it looks nice on a resume. Let's be honest, right? There's some professional development that's also happening there for our students and for all students.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so we also wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how we might be perceived, particularly by those around us, friends and family, when we go abroad.
Yeah, so in particular, when thinking of QT-POCs, some of those roadblocks or challenges that folks may experience are pieces around safety. So the 2 that we have on there on that slide is, how does the host country treat people of color, or how would people of color experience that environment? And then the same goes for LGBTQ folks. How will your identities, your social identities, truly work in that space? In particular, if it's an environment that you're going to be staying in for quite some time, for semester abroad, for even something longer than a week or just a week, what does that look like? And then there's some real pieces around financial concerns. So what I've seen a lot from my observation experience, and even for myself when I was an undergrad going abroad, there was a very significant financial aspect. This means that I am not working during the summer. This means I don't have work study. What does that do for my financial experience, not only in a U.S. context, and how do I work around that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the ways that families sort of perceive some of these issues, I mean, some of them are just concrete issues that have to be worked through in order to get abroad. And some of them are also just assumptions, right? Mm-hmm. Guesses that people are making. It may be that a student is first generation or has, nobody in their family has been abroad. Mm-hmm. So it's just a big black box of sometimes scary stuff based on news articles. In other cases, coming from a mixed race background where maybe one parent is white and one parent maybe is not both parents might not understand what that experience is going to look like the same. And I think it's hard to sort of transmit and prepare somebody for that from a family perspective. If you haven't had the same or similar experiences or the same kind of countries have visited in the past. And I also think not having access to funding, particularly if you want to do a program that has, say, queer content to it, might be Absolutely. One that some families are going to question, and because often they're the ones that are financially supporting that in some kind of way. So we have some ideas of tips or tricks, resources, and really we've just tried to write out some questions here that an advisor might ask a student. But I guess I'd invite you, any of the things we just talked about with family, friends, thinking through students' motivations and resources that they want to think about as they go abroad. If you have a tip or a thing that you'd like to share, now is a great time to just type that into the chat box. But these are some of the ways that I've thought about a little bit that an advisor might approach this. So as you can see from these questions put up here, things like what's important for you in selecting this program or country? Do you have certain desires or expectation? And then what if the realities are different than you expected? These are fairly general questions, right? But as you see, as the questions go down, some of them are more about what's the sense of who you are, how you express yourself. How can you be safe and supported in being yourself as much as possible in this new context, or how much is possible, right?
And I think it's important as educators that we're also asking ourselves these questions. Have you done the work and the research for countries that you're sending students to, or that you yourself will be going to and supporting the students? So around safety and wellness, around the planning of medical needs. If students have medical needs, for students that are transitioning or not transitioning, what does that look like?
Sure. Any kind of those sorts of issues can come up for folks. I think my view is that certainly advisors might have an idea of certain places might work out better for certain students, but I think that there's a lot of caution. I really believe there's a lot of caution that should be in there in terms of not advising somebody to not do something, right? To be like, don't go there and don't do that.
But giving them all the facts.
Right. Giving people information and empowering them to make decisions for themselves. It's sort of, you could put that under a risk reduction model of sorts, but I think it's about, and also not just putting the onus on ourselves as practitioners to know all the things, but to help students help themselves, right? So help them with them knowing what that they should be looking into and researching, because I don't think just because you're trans or just because you're gay or just because you're Asian American or Black or Latinx or whatever the specific identities of the student are, doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily like a certain country or have a bad experience or have a great experience. These are things that are often particular to the individual, where identity also matters, right? And so asking questions that also support identity is important, but not just asking them of people that you think that you think are, oh, well, you're the queer person of color, or you're the LGBT student, so you're the one that we should ask these questions to. I think all students ought to be thinking about some of these issues of contextual difference and ways of being themselves, or ways that they might need to modify how they express themselves in order to navigate a new and different environment.
I co-sign all of that.
So we want to talk a little bit also now about during travel, and certainly navigating identity within the program could be very important to that. I have a lot of different experiences in Mexico, and these photos are from my most recent trip to Mexico City. One is a drag cabaret performance at Dia de los Muertos, and one is a group of people, some from the US, some not, but we were all attending an LGBTI Human Rights International Conference that was hosted in Mexico City in 2014. But there are many different experiences I've had in these contexts, and starting to think about who am I, what does that mean? I've often been perceived as Mexican, right? Not always, especially when I start speaking Spanish, it starts to break down a little bit, those assumptions. But, I went to a university in Mexico City, and I was taking Spanish language classes, and the institute that taught them within the university actually had a policy that only the students enrolled in those programs, meaning international students pretty much, maybe some local folks who had immigrated, but those were the only people who could enter into that facility area. And basically, people would just walk in. Nobody would really get carded. But I got carded because I didn't look international enough. And so I was actually profiled for looking Mexican in Mexico. And I think that says a lot, right? I think it makes one have to think about, well, how am I perceived? And I mean, that doesn't mean I am those things, but I think that it means a lot about kind of how that I'm treated. And for me, it opened up. It led to me having conversations with some of the other students in the program, particularly some of Asian descent, about how that they felt they were perceived in Mexico City and how that experience was playing out for them. I've had other experiences in Mexico working with, traveling with friends, with other people, with students, and sometimes just thinking about, for example, somebody who has Mexican heritage, right, but who's maybe not been to Mexico City before. I mean, that could play out lots of different ways depending on the individual. But I've also seen situations where I think people become hyper aware about their own heritage and how it relates to that space. So it could be having a high level of being upset about anything that seems colonial or about colonization, feeling sometimes that, I don't want somebody to teach me about my own heritage unless they also are from that background, right? And I think that plays out in heritage language learning as well for a lot of people. But just kind of that consciousness. And I'd also say, having gone abroad also with Black identified U.S. students, those, I think for any particular racial background, but I think I hear it a lot with anti-Blackness and how that it plays out in different spaces. I don't feel that as an instructor, I want to engage people in reflection, right? And I want to create a group where different people can discuss identity and race and difference and how these things are playing out within the country context while we're there. And that's great and important. But I also want to recognize that I and a group can't necessarily always respond to the specific concerns and needs of a student.
And I think that really connects with our next slide. So in navigating identity as program administrators or instructors, what can we do? So what Nick just talked about, as an administrator or educator, if not sharing that identity with someone, acknowledging that sometimes that large group discussion isn't always the best and effective thing. How can we utilize small groups, race alike or identity alike spaces so that folks can connect to others that share that similar identity or identities, and even connect, what are your connections to larger non-local networks? So I know when I went, in particular, my birthright experience, so all of us identified as Jewish in some way, shape, or form. All of us identified as queer in some way, shape, or form. But the first time we really talked about our identity, I highlighted that my understanding of my own queerness and why I love that word is because it allows me not to necessarily be a box, but more of an octagon. And all of my identities play out in this octagon. So identifying as someone who's Black. The next day, someone said, "Oh, you know what, Jacquis, I had no idea you were Black. I just thought you were a little darker." And that, blew me away. Also acknowledging my privilege of my whiteness and how I understand my color of my skin. But also then having to have a conversation with someone who didn't see me as Black. And that was a bit traumatizing. So in that moment, it was, okay, maybe we can talk about Judaism, maybe we can talk about being queer, or LGBTQ, but what about my race? Where was I seeing that? Those are some struggles. And so how, as educators, can we find those connections and encourage our students to also make those connections? And I think it's imperative as educators that we're acknowledging all the identities that we hold, that the participants hold, and what are the power dynamics, if any, which we know there will be, then an educator with students in that group.
And again, I would say at this moment, if you have some thoughts going through your head or experiences you've had as a facilitator or instructor, or administrator with a program or advisor, what kinds of questions help students work through these identity pieces.
I think we think it's imperative to raise issues of identity and difference. We've been talking about this with students, allowing folks to share their own narrative, but also share what they feel comfortable with. And then creating an environment where these discussions can take place. a reflection of not only US context, but also in that global perspective. So again, going back to that very first quote, well, actually both quotes, so intersectionality and that thinking globally. How can these come up for our students in an academic field as well as in just the discussions that we have together in that reflective piece after? Do you want to add more?
Yeah, and I think some of the points we put on this current slide, one of the key words in here is just allowing people to share, and where these issues of identity can be actively brought up. I think it's important, some of those words, because we also don't want to create an environment where people are forced to share things that are uncomfortable or that put them in a precarious position. But that I think, this is very similar, I think, to even domestic LGBT work that I'm involved in, which is that when we talk about diversity, we often have to say what we mean by diversity.
Absolutely.
And we have to do this up front as we're building community, and we have to give examples and be willing, I think, as one of the previous slides talked about, recognizing our own identities, being willing to talk about as practitioners some of our own experiences and bringing that into the space, not just expecting students to do it or putting people in the position where they feel that they have to, and it could be uncomfortable. So speaking a little bit about the ways that we're seen or not seen, the ways that there might be stereotypes or there might just simply be cultural differences when students or participants or people generally are going abroad. Here I just had a couple of photos from a trip to India, or a couple of trips to India. And what I was reflecting on was a number of things. One is that you're seeing a Buddhist cave from a set of caves that go back 2,000 years, and just remembering, again, like the Serbia example, there are many different groups that maybe even have their origins in these places but are still minorities, right, within these own contexts. So keeping in mind even like sort of that nuance of culture that is not flat. And the same for the students, I think, in the way that students might come into a context, they might think that everyone in this country is of a certain religion because that's the dominant one, and really being able to dispel some of that. Or the example of what appears to be two men holding hands in certain countries. From a U.S. context, many of our students might think, well, that's something that's about sexual orientation, and in reality, that might just be about personal expression, friendship. It might be a lot of other things underneath that. And I had some photos of different friends I was meeting with or friends that I was traveling with. And I'm just remembering the many, just some of the stories that were shared, because each of the people in the photos are from different ethnic and often national backgrounds. And the ways that people experienced that space was very different. Sometimes feeling not visible in that space, sometimes feeling hyper visible as well. So there's a few things that you could do as a program administrator. Certainly, I'd say building that awareness about these differences. So sometimes what we see is not the reality of what's going on underneath it. And I felt, when I studied in Amsterdam, that was my first time studying abroad. And really, I had a great academic director in that program who would constantly be asking kind of, well, why do you think that? And, I was sometimes making verbal judgments about things, but I was really being asked, right, by a person of authority, why? Why do you think that? And where do you think that your thoughts about that come from? And why do you think it might be different in this context? And constantly being asked that, not being allowed to get away with, let me just make my own guesses and assumptions and instant judgments on what it is I'm experiencing.
So someone just typed something in. It says, on group programs, it can be important / helpful to set aside time for a facilitated group discussion, reflection, dialogue to address intergroup dynamics involving our multiple identities, and a 20-30 minute daily reflection can be really effective. I co-sign this. During a spring break, I was lucky enough in graduate school to take some undergraduate students to Mexico for a week, and we built homes with an organization that Seattle University is connected with there. And it may be a big part of the Jesuit identity to reflect, but we did this. We had a daily reflection on our identities and how they played out in Mexico, as well as what did it mean to be in community with others and serve with others, which is a very big difference between serving for someone. And so that community piece, that reflection piece, we did on a daily basis. I would absolutely, again, co-sign this. It's a really great tip, and it's really effective for students to understand their own identities as well as how those play out and impact others.
I think if you're wanting also a theoretical or academic perspective, this is an opportunity to kind of go back to Kolb's experiential learning cycle and really just thinking about those pieces. Because for me, when I've asked different practitioners, like, well, what do you think? This is just something I'm personally very interested in, but what makes an experience abroad, or really any experience, particularly a short-term one, like a 1 week or a couple weeks long, what makes that really impactful, right? And so I've often wondered, well, what can we do as program designers, program administrators, facilitators do? What do you think are the critical elements? And often I've heard from folks that they feel that one of the most critical elements is the reflection, the quality of reflection, the depth of reflection, that it's not just about having experiences and learning kind of surface level information or just information, right? It's about also processing, how do I personally relate to this? What does this mean to me? Who am I in this context? And I often find that people going abroad think that they're going to learn a lot about another context, but the reality often is they learn a lot about themselves by being in another context, by having to, if it's being processed well, by having to sort of confront who is it that you are. Maybe what kind of economic privilege and passport privilege might you have, depending on where you're coming from as part of that group, and what are the different things happening within that group and the dynamics of it as well. So I'd say like reflection has been consistently, at least when I've discussed it with folks, brought up as like that's the key. And it's really about the quality of that.
So wellness and community, these are just some photos from my heritage travels specifically, not necessarily any non-heritage frolicking that I've done outside of the US. The two closest to the right, the one upper right-hand corner is myself and some other folks voguing in Dangriga, Belize, before making our way off to Placencia. And some of my father's roots come from Dangriga, which is a really great, beautiful space for folks who haven't gone to Belize. Please do. And then the lower, almost right-hand corner, that's us visiting a burial site deep in a cave, which was really amazing. And then the other two are from my trip to Israel. So it was during Birthright. The one in the mid-center is just, it's us visiting the wall, and folks that wanted to reconfirm their Judaism in a little ceremony that folks did, pick a name, your Jewish name, that's what folks did. And then the back right, or all the way to the left, not the right, is just myself, again, looking flawless with some friends while hiking in Israel. So wellness and community, things that educators, instructors, administrators can do. We've been talking about this the whole time, educate folks. So what's the access to medical facilities and insurance coverage for students? Guidance on relationship safety, especially I think for students that are going on a semester abroad. One of the big pieces for folks are relationships, right? For students that may identify as QT-POC and aren't out and don't have those experiences back home, what does it look like to enjoy another culture, another space in that very significant intimacy with one another, with someone else? And then information on local laws, just a very real practical thing around laws for LGBTQ folks, and then also looking at what race looks like with those laws. Encouraging deeper immersion into the host culture. We've talked about this already as well. What are local customs? What are monuments and religious spaces that you can invite these students to go to, and that you take the students to? And then affinity spaces. So we talked about it being imperative to create affinity spaces, whether group dynamics or group discussions on a daily basis, weekly basis. But what are university community centers? Where are they? What do they look like? Support groups, maybe peer-led or in community centers. And then what's the local nightlife? Again, we acknowledge that students want to play and frolic and not just necessarily go to class.
I'm, I'm curious some of your own experiences here, particularly in terms of like how have you sought kind of to create space for yourself or to get support, especially if the majority of people in that program don't, whether it's like racial identity or sexual orientation, gender identity, like.
It was a different, so thinking of my 2 heritage trips in Belize, so again, I spent 4 months there. So y'all, I was looking to frolic. And it was curious. It wasn't my racial identity that was questioned. It was my sexuality and what that looked like for women in Belize that were seeking other women for sex or relationships. A lot of it was house parties, and it took me a good month and a half to find one and to acknowledge that you don't talk openly about them. You don't say where they were located. It was always a different home. So that was a very curious dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
However, I found that my race being supported there and that exploration felt a lot more salient and supportive of an environment than when I went to Israel. And it was the race dynamic, and that's just my one experience, right? I want to acknowledge that Birthright was amazing for my religious aspect and that reflection and that identity development. But around anti-Blackness, it was extremely difficult. So at Israel, we did go to bars and clubs and enjoyed ourselves and danced. But I found that it was extremely difficult to discuss race with others, and it was extremely difficult to discuss the intersectionality of my race and my queerness, and to talk about what it meant being a woman of color when I was the only one that identified as a woman of color. That was extremely difficult.
Yeah. Well, and so I would again invite, for those that are listening in, if you have any tips, thoughts, things that have been helpful for you in your work, whether it's on pre-program, on-program kinds of things, in addressing identity and intersectionality, go ahead and type that into the chat box if you want to share that. We do have one question from Lindsay.
I can read it. So it says, the institute I work at has a predominantly white population. As the staff advisor to LGBTQ student organization on campus, I have been struggling to provide support for these types of power dynamic discussions because of my white, cis, and falsely assumed heterostatus privilege. Do you have any suggestions on helping LGBTQ students of color feel more comfortable discussing things with me? You know what, that's difficult. It's a very real thing that our identities impact the work that we get to do with students and the students that innately connect with us. It's imperative to show students that we're not allies, but we're advocates. So having those programs specifically for that student population, I know that at MICA, where I'm at, so again, I identify as mixed race. I don't identify as monoracially white. My LGBTQ student population is predominantly white for the folks that are out and visible, which I think is also a key piece there. I made sure that we just had LGBTQ programming, and it was through passive tea hours. It was a luncheon that was invite only, and then we asked folks to bring a friend. As we grew it, we decided to make it something bigger and better. And I would also say it's okay, in my experience as an educator, I'm okay with making my white students uncomfortable and discussing their race, discussing what their whiteness looks like and how it impacts the fact that in their student organization, no one identifies as a person of color. Why are those folks not showing up?
In some ways, I feel like this is an area that doesn't have, for me at least, there's no magical like answer to here's exactly what to do. And I think I can understand on some level how that plays out for white folks, but not identifying as one.
Absolutely.
I think I see things from a bit of a different lens. Some of it for me, yes, I mean, there are ways that people can do anti-racism work and workshops, just even to raise racial justice. What does it mean? How does white privilege play out in queer spaces and trans spaces, for example? But often I'm interested in building queer and trans people of color communities. And I think doing so from an ally perspective is probably not the most doable, right? It's very difficult, I think, to engage. So sometimes I think the answers are in empowering role models, staff, faculty, making sure that people are actually hiring queer and trans people of color.
That's extremely important, yeah.
And
retaining.
Right.
Too.
And because I've noticed that often the most powerful work around LGBTQ people of color comes from those who identify with those identities. And some of that is that relates to what people's personal interests and what they want to spend their time on. But some of it also, I think, is about kind of who among the student community is going to relate and feel like they want to work with that person, and so that can be a challenge.
Yeah, I think Nick brings up a great point. Where's that mentorship? Where can it come from? And being mindful of, though we don't want to tokenize our colleagues, because that's really important not to do. How do we seek mentorship or support for our students that identify as QT-POCs with colleagues that identify with those identities as well. Also acknowledging that sometimes our students at any given day, they're more focused on maybe their racial identity or their queerness. What does that look like to really connect folks?
But I've found, in at least my own experience in building some of these intersectional spaces, is that the things that seem to work for some other identities or for some other general programming just do not work, right? And I think some of that's because the level of fear and the level of trust that needs to be built is very different. And so I don't approach, like, even if I'm going to create a program or advertise it that I think is about queer and trans people of color, I'm typically not going to just like blast it on email newsletters.
Absolutely.
Right? I'm going to talk to people one-to-one, and those one-to-ones are going to be based on relationships that are built over time. And so it is a lot of extra work on the front end, but I've found that's one of the only truly effective ways to do intersectional community building.
Our LGBTQ of color luncheon started just like that. It was a small group of students, and then I said, okay, invite a friend that has this identity. How do we build up your community? Acknowledging that some programs I put on, I do not participate physically because I may not share that identity. And what does it mean to have an affinity space and me be there when I shouldn't?
We have more questions, but I think we've got only a couple more slides, so we'll just do the final ones and then answer that question and any others that if you've got something in your mind right now, you might want to type it in. That's totally fine. But in the post-travel piece, really just briefly making sure that we also cover, I think it's often the part that we forget about in designing the international programs and executing them, sometimes because of resources, but what happens when the program is done? And here I've got for myself a couple of photos from Amsterdam, and most recently I was there during the Canal Pride Parade. And it was just such, it's such an empowering space for me in some ways. In other ways, it's also a challenging space. And I think especially in terms of race dynamics in the Netherlands, or ethnicity, nationality dynamics. But, like when I had studied abroad as an undergrad, it was transformative for me. And I think coming back to the US, I was often looking for spaces where I could talk about that in ways that could be understood, or where I could talk to people who related or had similar experiences. And it was just a very challenging thing to find.
One of the photos, it's mine, and it's the lower left-hand corner. I got really lucky where someone that went on that trip with me to Israel, to that birthright trip, actually lived in Baltimore. He was about 20 minutes away then. He is now a whole 5-minute walk from me. So we live in the same neighborhood and see each other often. And it was amazing to reconnect with him in that way. And there's been moments where we have absolutely challenged one another about the trip, and then in general, how our identities played out on that trip. I would say that trip in particular, I had a fantastic, my supervisor at the time, who identifies as a straight white cis woman, gave me a really great book on queer international Israel and Palestine, and I read it. And when I got back on from the trip, we discussed the book together, and it discussed my experience in it. Um, and that was really, really amazing. Before I went to Israel, I was familiar with the term pinkwashing, but not too much. After experiencing some moments where I felt again my race being challenged or something that was a bit traumatic, going back home and getting to read articles about pinkwashing, getting to speak to this supervisor slash mentor of mine, and have that book and have articles at my disposal, extremely beneficial and absolutely impacted then pieces of who I am as an educator now. Mm-hmm. So we want folks to talk to their students one-on-one or in group discussions. Topics can be like, what did they learn while they were abroad? How have they integrated or will be integrating those lessons into their daily academic or social life? How are they talking to family or friends? All that jazz. And then where might they be struggling? We also acknowledge that reflective journal exercises can be amazing in this time and period. We also discussed implementing student panels and programming around cultural competency and involving those participants, anyone from even the past years in the development and implementation of those programs. And then what does it look like to have your students connect to maybe the Multicultural Center, the LGBTQ Center as support resources, as well as other individual colleagues that you may have.
Mm-hmm. And I think some of that reflects back on what Nicole in the chat box was suggesting about having the panels. I think it is important to think about kind of the dynamics of those student panels. Yes, like peer education is a powerful tool. Sometimes though, when we do diversity panels, if all of your panelists of color are heterosexual, cisgender people, if all of your LGB or if you have trans panelists may be white, what does that then reflect back to the students, right? In terms of, I know sometimes it's hard to find somebody who wants to speak about their experiences, but I think the more at least we can be cognizant that, like, by setting up a diversity panel where people only reflect one aspect of their identity, that it sometimes reinforces, I think, for the viewers that, queerness is white and being a person of color is straight and cisgender.
And who can go abroad, right? So that bigger piece, when we think pre-travel, do I see myself and the folks that are going abroad? I have these concerns for my safety. What do my family and friends think? Getting that visibility is really important. And if you're not the person that went away or went abroad with the students, what does it look like to have a one-on-one with that person or those folks and see what their experience was like? Get some more information from them. And then, generally assessment is always nice too.
So we've got a couple of questions that were already put in the chat box. If you have more questions, things that you're thinking about, now would be the time to ask those. But one of these is about, are there any great online resources that you recommend that you might link to on your own website for students who might not prefer to discuss the topic directly with their study abroad advisor or other campus staff? And there was another, I don't know.
Oh, I can
There was another question about the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I can do the book quickly. So the title of the book is Israel/Palestine and the Queer International. And it's by Sarah with an H. Schultzman, and that last name is Schulman. Really great book.
For online resources, I'm not quite sure. Maybe some folks who are in the session might have a suggestion. something that's kind of a general LGBTQ people of color abroad. I don't know.
I know generally when I went abroad, I Googled
Yeah.
LGBTQ abroad. Unfortunately, as far as the POC component goes, you're not going to find a lot of searches for or results for Google, but I know that there's a lot around even countries having their travel.org sites have things around LGBTQ experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's harder to find something that very specifically addresses intersectional pieces,
Absolutely.
and I think it would be definitely easier to find things that address, race on the one hand and ethnicity, and then on the other hand, perhaps LGBTQ plus identities. One of the things I know a number of universities have, for example, included those kinds of pieces as part of their pre-departure orientations for all students, that there's some sort of article addressing, sexual orientation or gender identity or just identity in abroad, right? And how that is different.
And I think that emphasis is all students.
Right. That
all students are getting this information.
Right. And I would say in my own experience, what can be very powerful for a student that has a real particular concern, and I've worked with a number of LGBTQ plus students of color who are thinking about going abroad or who are, it's how can I tap my networks? I know that not everybody has like super strong networks in every country. None of us has that. But like assisting the student in figuring out how to do the research, right? And so it may be a book or material that's really specific to like your example with the Israel-Palestine queer book. But the last time I'm going to Japan this weekend, and I'm going to go check out the Tokyo Rainbow Pride as part of the reason I'm going. And so it is both a heritage and a queer focused trip. But, I've been reading about Shinto, and I got a book to try to understand more. And I'm trying to understand more about kind of how queerness is seen in some of those spaces. Even the last time I went to Japan, in 2000, I took a book with me called Queer Japan. So I think you would find for many countries there's some sort of article, book, and if you can't find a material resource, I've often connected students to particular people, whether it was in country, or I've connected students, say, to like a Black travelers network, right? So that people can connect with people that they might have some similar experiences with or want to bounce concerns or ideas off of. Now we have lots of things coming in.
We have lots of things, which is fantastic. So I think right below Bill's link, and thank you, Bill, for putting that book link on there from Amazon. So we have, does anyone recommend how we can encourage our students to self-identify during the advising process, i.e. is there something we can say to ensure that they feel comfortable when discussing confidentially so we can better advise them? And some folks have highlighted starting off with just making what are the visual cues for your office to be LGBTQ friendly. I think that's absolutely real, but there's only so much that a placard can do, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in that space are safe or that the student will innately feel comfortable now that you have a sticker. That's just real. And quite there, we also have something saying if your campus or local community offers LGBTQ identity training, it can also be helpful for your staff to receive that. I completely agree. I think that you can also have it as if you're having the students fill out demographic questions, which they should be doing anyway, just so that whether it be for your assessment or just so you know who's going on your study abroad trips, having them be optional demographic questions and asking that piece around all of their social identities, or in particular race, gender, and sexuality, because ultimately, how do we know the pronoun usage of our students? We should be asking. And maybe it is as simple as having it on a survey, and it's an optional opportunity for them to highlight that their pronouns are she, her, hers, or they, them, theirs.
Sure, and as practitioners, if we're comfortable sharing our own pronouns, that's going to help our students to feel that they can share what theirs are as well. I think that could be also in group settings like pre-departure orientations. And, I think one of the ideas may be when you have advising session, is there an intake form? And not just what are your demographic identities, that may be helpful for assessment purposes. But, I'm always a bit uncomfortable with the idea of, just because you identify as something means that I'm going to discuss that particular thing. I think there's maybe a question of, would you like to discuss, and then here's some options.
I think that's a great.
Like race, ethnicity while abroad, sexual orientation while abroad, gender or gender identity while abroad.
And that intake can also highlight, do they have concerns? So those questions that we were asking earlier, how do you put those on the intake form? I think that's a great piece, Nick.
Well, with that, we have to wrap up at this point, and so we're going to turn it back to our host to close, I believe. That, or we're just done here. Yes. Is there?
Hi.
Yes. Sure. We were going to also add our email addresses into the chat box so that folks can be in touch with us if they have further questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick and Jacquis. The presentation was really wonderful, and I think it's important to highlight this intersectionality piece that often can get lost in conversations about diversity and inclusion. So really, again, thank you so much. And as a reminder, all of the webinars are recorded and available on the Summer Over the Rainbow website. And at this time, I'd like to extend a special thank you to all of the presenters throughout the webinar series, as well as our collaborators at the Consortium for Higher Education LGBT Resource Professionals, as well as all of you who have tuned in throughout the month. Also at this time, I'd like to again invite all of you who are interested to consider attending the second Somewhere Over the Rainbow conference, which is going to be hosted by the University of Maryland College Park, scheduled again for April 20th, 2017. Also, please consider submitting program proposals if you are interested in presenting, and more information about what that process looks like will be shared soon. Thank you all again, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all.
Bye.